Okay, what I'm going to do here is reprise a presentation that I gave at the hospital for our providers at the hospital and the ski clinics that was fairly popular, and I think answered a lot of folks' questions about the COVID-19 vaccine because as at least in Summit County, the first response agencies, including transporting and non-transporting EMS, so that includes search and rescue and ski patrol, have been given the opportunity to sign up for the COVID-19 vaccine clinic starting on Saturday. And I assume that in our neighboring counties, you have this opportunity as well or will very shortly. So I'm just going to go through and kind of cover a quick reminder of what are viruses, how do they work, what are vaccines, how do they work? Why do they work? How do we create them? How do we test them? What do we know about the COVID-19 vaccines? Are they safe? Are they effective? And what are some considerations you might have as an individual? And then we can jump into questions. So a quick reminder of how viruses work. Viruses are not truly alive. They're these little replication machines with DNA or RNA in them. Encapsulated in a protein shell, and their entire purpose in life is to make more of themselves in your cells, in your body, and to spread themselves to other hosts and repeat that process forever and ever and ever. That's pretty much why they exist, because they do that. And the way they do that is they get into your body somehow, and they enter one of your cells, and they basically hijack some of the machinery inside your cell and tell it, follow these instructions that are encoded in my genetic material. And the instructions are make more virus, make more copies of that RNA, make more copies of the protein sheath, make hundreds, make thousands of these, and then spit them out so they can go off and make more of themselves. And how do they get into your cell? So the membrane that encapsulates the genetic material to protect it on its way to your cell is also coated in proteins that act kind of like a key, looking for a lock on your cell. And when the key enters that lock, it basically allows that membrane to join your cell's membrane, spits that genetic material into your cell, and long story short, it then hijacks your cell's machinery, makes more copies, and in the process of fulfilling its goal in life, bad things happen to you because your immune system reacts to it. Because when your cell's machinery gets hijacked to make more viruses, it doesn't do the things that it ought to be doing to keep your body functioning. And so we see the result of these things with our cells malfunctioning, cell death, immune response, and we know these. You've all had a common cold, right? So you get a fever, you get a runny nose. These viruses make your body do things that make it more likely to spread the virus around. Cough, snot pouring out your nose. These are all mechanisms that magnify its ability to get into other hosts. And I have this little diagram here of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is the virus that causes COVID-19. And there's a couple of memorable proteins on it. One that I really want to point out is the spike protein on the outside, and that's the key that the COVID uses to get in your cells, binds to the ACE2 receptor on our cells. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. So what do we do about that? How does our body react to these infections? Because malfunctioning of our cells in our body can lead to very bad things, but our body has good mechanisms to fight infections, although sometimes that goes a little haywire. Long story short, we have these short and long-term reactions to infection. And what our body recognizes are various markers or proteins, such as that spike protein, as not self, and it goes, oh, well, that's bad. We should probably do something about that. We should kill it. We should create things that will recognize and kill it, and we should come up with a couple ways to do that. Some of that's non-specific, like fevers. That's a normal reaction to infection. We have these inflammatory responses that help generally fight off infection. And then we also create these specific adaptive immune responses like antibodies that bind to those proteins on the outside of the virus and keep it from working. That's how antibodies work. And then we have these other cells. We have T cells, cytotoxic T cells, memory T cells, memory B cells that go out and they look for infected cells and kill those cells with the cytotoxic T cells. And then we have memory cells that basically go, oh, aha, I've seen this before. Let's react to this in a targeted manner. Let's make some antibodies. That's how our body remembers infection and fights it off in the future. This is really important because if we get infected with something, we'd like not to get infected to it again. Well, that's kind of where vaccines come in. Because vaccines are this really cool tool that trigger our immune reaction. We present it with an antigen, with one of those proteins, and we get this immunogenic response, and the body is trained to react and fight off infection without having to actually suffer the infection, without having to come up with this adaptive response while it's actively being hijacked and infected by these viruses. And that's a good thing because we know that bad things happen when we're infected with these diseases. And also we know that the body isn't necessarily ahead of the game when it's reacting. An immune response is like trying to build a plane while you're flying it. If you're fighting off an active infection, it's way better to train the immune system. That's what vaccines do. And then you get to avoid the infection. That's good. So we don't have these systemic inflammatory processes. Vaccines don't have a goal to reproduce and make more of themselves and infect more things. They have one goal, and that's to induce an immune reaction. And so we don't get cell death and haywire processes and a whole bunch of different proteins that our body would typically react to, sometimes in a bad way. Sometimes we can create immune reactions that are harmful to the cell. And we certainly have seen that with COVID along with many other diseases. So the ultimate thing we can take from this is if we jump out of the individual who we're trying to protect and look at a population or society, you also get some really great benefits out of vaccines. And one that you may have heard thrown about is something called herd immunity. And that's where you have infections that naturally burn themselves out. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you have a given disease and it has what we call a base pair reproduction number, let's say that number is 2. What we mean by that is in a naive population, you have one infection that creates 2 on the average. And those 2 infections create 4, and 4 create 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 5, 12, 10, 24, 20, 48, 40, 96. And then you understand that that steep curve that you look at when you look at the infection rates and how a few cases can jump to thousands, tens of thousands, millions over the course of weeks and months. That's bad. What we want is one infected person on average to infect less than one more person. And we do that by making the average person that they interact with not able to be infected. And the only way that you can truly achieve that in a large population over time is through vaccination. And it's worth saying that the more infectious a disease is, say measles, the most infectious disease we know of, the more people have to be immune. When you take a disease like COVID, we tend to think that probably somewhere around 2/3, maybe 3/4 of people, if they were immune, infections would naturally burn themselves out. So I have a cool little graphic that kind of illustrates how different levels of immunity in a population prevent spread. You can see if 0% of people are immune in that upper left box, naturally the disease spreads exponentially until a very high proportion of the population is infected. And as you proceed along and have more and more folks who are immune, eventually an infection is walled off within a population. It can't spread anymore. That's what herd immunity is. You can't achieve it through natural infection. No disease in a large population has ever made itself extinct through natural infection. Only vaccines can do this. So how do we get vaccines? It's a rather complex thing. It turns out that vaccine processes are focused on two things at all levels. First, safety, and second, efficacy. It's like, well, we want a vaccine that works, but we also want a vaccine that doesn't cause more problems than it solves, because that would be counterproductive. So you start out with basic research and you figure out what you want to make, and you do some preclinical studies. And then ultimately, you may have heard the terms phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. That's when they're tested in people. When you think you have a vaccine product that will create immunity and do it safely, you start testing first in really small groups, phase 1, looking, make sure, all right, is this safe? Then you're talking about dozens of people. Then you start testing in hundreds of people, and you start doing dose finding trials. Well, how much vaccine do I need to stimulate the immune system to train it? And is it also still safe? And then you hop along to phase 3, and now you're talking about tens of thousands of people. And now you're doing high level studies, what we call a randomized controlled trial. You look for demographics that you want included, like we want a broad group of different ages, different comorbidities, different races, an equal balance of the sexes. That's what you include. But after that point, you randomize who gets the vaccine and who gets something called a placebo. And a placebo, in this case, is basically an injection of salt water, something that would not work like a vaccine would. But we want to remove bias, and we want to remove both bias in what is known by the researchers, that's through blinding. They don't know who gets the vaccine and who does not. And in the recipients, because if you knew you were getting the vaccine, you might do things like take higher risks of exposure, right? So you've got to make sure that no one knows whether or not they had the vaccine, researchers and participants both, until you reach your primary endpoints. And what you're looking for is like, okay, we're going to, say in the Pfizer trial, take 44,000 people across 5 different countries, and we're going to give half of them the placebo and half of the vaccine. And when we know that, say, around 150 of them have COVID, then we'll go back and look and see which one of those 150 got the vaccine, which got the placebo, and then we can figure out how effective it was. What is the relative reduction in risk by getting that vaccine? And I love talking about risk. And it's easy to talk about risk to this group, I think, because mountain rescue, fire, ski patrol, you all deal with risk, particularly low frequency, high consequence stuff. That's like your bread and butter, particularly if you're in the avalanche world or the structural fire world. And that's something we talk about a lot when we're talking about safety data and vaccines. So this is another good graphical representation that just shows who you include in these different studies. They grow exponentially to where, say, between the Pfizer and the Moderna trials, over 75,000 participants, but now we have a few million people who have received the vaccine at this point, including over 50,000 people in the state of Colorado. So let's talk about vaccines in general and how we make and design these vaccines, and we'll talk about the ones specifically. Because we want to train the body, and we want to present it with those antigens. And that can be really hard to mass produce those. So, I mean, the simplest way you could do this is to make the protein you want the body to react to, say that spike protein off the coronavirus. That can be hard to produce. That can be hard to stabilize. And to produce something that matches exactly what you want. So it's actually easier to present the protein a different way. Now, traditionally, you do things like kill a virus and inject people with dead virus, or attenuate it, make it weak. That's not what any of the current COVID vaccines are. There is no dead virus vaccine. There is no attenuated virus vaccine. Everything is meant to produce a protein. And the 3 methods are either to make that purified protein in a lab, or we can take a virus And instead of having the instructions in the virus say, make more virus, we cut all of that out and introduce an instruction that just says, make this protein. And so that you can actually put it in a virus that has only that instruction and it infects cells, and then it produces the spike protein you want your body to react to. Or we actually shortcut that process and just introduce the strand of RNA that is required to have your body make that protein. Let me explain how that works. If you remember back to like your high school biology, your cells aren't these monolithic things. They're split up. They have their envelope. They have their nucleus in the center, and that has DNA in it. That has all the instructions on how the cell ought to operate, right? And then in the cytoplasm, there's all these little organs. We're all athletes, right? So we think in terms of like mitochondria, and that's the cellular engine. There's also this little organ in your cell called ribosomes, and that's a protein factory. And its job is to take messenger RNA that's spat out of the nucleus and follow the instructions on it, which say, make the following protein. And that's the way mRNA vaccines work. We take mRNA, code it so that it says, make the spike protein, and we use our incredibly reliable, incredibly efficient natural organelles, those ribosomes, to create that in the body for us. This is good and reliable and safe, and it's actually one of the cleanest methods that you could use to create this target protein, which is why they've wanted to do it for a long time. This has actually been an idea on the books for quite a while. Over 30 years, actually, it's been a work in progress. They've actually made several candidate vaccines, but they weren't able to get them out before they were either no longer needed, like Zika was viewed as no longer a threat. Where mRNA was actually put into clinical trials was as a cancer treatment. It was found to be very safe. But the biggest problem that they ran into is it just wasn't effective. Why? Because it's not a very stable molecule. In fact, like if your body sees mRNA, the immune system will react to it and destroy it. It's not very stable. It doesn't last very long in the body. So the recent breakthrough was just creating a way to get it into the cells where the ribosome could say, okay, I will make this protein a few times before the mRNA naturally breaks down. That's what the unique technology is. It's not the mRNA. It's just wrapping it in a little lipid membrane, a lipid nanoparticle. Right. So we understand the process of mRNA. It's not new technology, and it has a lot of advantages. And one of the biggest ones is that it's really simple to create and refine. It's a cleaner process to deliver. It's a simpler process in the body. Actually, the vaccines that are in use have no preservatives in them, which is a unique thing. And it's faster to get to testing. And testing is actually what takes the most time in vaccine development because we're looking for that safety and we're looking for that efficacy. So was this a rush? Because we hear a lot of people saying like, well, this is a rushed vaccine. And I got to say, like naming the entire development process Operation Warp Speed, well, that was a really bad choice of name. Actually, they should have called it Operation Maximum Effort. Why we were able to develop a vaccine in record time here is a couple reasons. One, there was a whole lot of vaccine work done on the very close cousins of COVID, and that is SARS and MERS. And the next thing is that, like, if you look at the last 70 years of vaccine development, we never had anything like we have now. Like the first vaccines that were out, there was no concept of genetic material. Now, in January, they were able to fully sequence the entire genome of the SARS-CoV-2 virus in January, send it by email across the planet to hundreds of different labs who were then able to start work on it, including choosing an mRNA sequence literally over the weekend to code for that protein that they knew would be needed to train the immune system. And so, no, we shouldn't be shocked. Like, never before in human history has so much effort been put into vaccine development. And when you look at like what was done out there, unprecedented resources were put into creating 198 different vaccine candidates, 53 of which are in trials. And the 2 that we have available today were just the first ones who were able to get through their safety and efficacy portions to their primary endpoint of the phase 3 trial, to where someone could look and evaluate what is the risk versus the benefit. And I think when we look back in time at the great achievements of humanity, you think about the 7 wonders of the world, or the Manhattan Project, or the Apollo program, the COVID-19 vaccine development project will rank up there in human achievement. The ability to stop a worldwide pandemic by vaccine development within a calendar year, that is remarkable, and it's a testament to the effort that went into it. And the best has risen to the top. And I think that the other thing that's really sped this along, unfortunately, is the fact that we're in a pandemic. When you do normal vaccine development, remember I said primary endpoint is going to be to get X many infections across your entire study group and then unblind and figure out who had the vaccine and who had the placebo. Well, that can take a long time. Say if you look at the HPV vaccine, that took a while for enough infections to result. COVID-19 is rampant, it's pandemic, and it did not take that long to get enough infections to be able to evaluate. By the way, what's in the vaccine? I mentioned this is one of the most simple formulations that we've seen in vaccine out there. So you have the mRNA, which is then wrapped in lipids, in a phospholipid proprietary bilayer. And that's to protect it long enough to get into your cells. And then, pardon me, some salts and buffers to make it more neutral in the body. And then Moderna added some sugars to make it more temperature stable, which is why it doesn't have to have the ultra low temp stabilization. So what did the data say from these trials? We look at like the Pfizer trial was age 16 up, double blind, placebo-controlled, random-controlled trial. Over 44,000 participants, over 30,000 in the Moderna trial. When they unblinded and went back and looked, what they were able to do is separate out the vaccine arm from the placebo arm and see like who got infected when. And that's what this graph is over on the right. This is from the Pfizer trial, and the Moderna one looks very, very similar. So on the lower half of the graph, what you have is time after your first vaccine dose. And by the way, like these are both dual dose vaccines. So Pfizer is dose 1, and then 21 days later you get a second dose. Moderna is 28 days. So the red dots are infections in the placebo group. They didn't get the vaccine. The blue line is the vaccine group. We don't have to do any statistical analysis on this. It's like bleeding obvious just how much of a difference there is between these two groups. But when you do the statistical analysis, what you find is the vaccine effectiveness is very high. So 94.8% for Pfizer, 94.1% for Moderna. And again, that is a relative risk reduction. So if you get the vaccine, your risk of getting COVID is reduced by 94.8 or 94.1%. And by the way, the confidence intervals overlap here. So it's not like you're like, oh, well, I definitely want the Pfizer over the Moderna. Like they're so close that it's not really significant. I got the Pfizer vaccine a little over a week ago, and I would have happily had the Moderna one if that was the first one offered to me. So, and it's worth noting these numbers are for 10 days after second dose on Pfizer and 14 days after second dose on Moderna. That's just where they took their measurement points. Now, it's worth noting, like the people they included, they were really, really well-designed trials, like impressively well done. And also, given that these vaccines were very similar, the fact that the results are also so similar is quite reassuring. That being said, there's some populations that were not studied. You naturally exclude certain populations for ethical reasons from these studies. those who are profoundly immunocompromised, like those on high levels of chemotherapy, for example, or lactating and pregnant women are naturally excluded. So there's not a whole lot of study data on that, but there are some things to be said about that, and more on a slide coming up. The safety data was really impressive too. So not only are these good at reducing COVID-19, the people who still got COVID-19 with the vaccine, because some people just are not going to react. That's normal. Like 0 cases of severe COVID-19 in the Moderna group, and only a single case of severe COVID-19 in the Pfizer group. That means that like the people who still got it, the few who still got it, it was mild or moderate cases. Now, one thing they didn't test for here was whether in that reduction of severity, there were still a lot of like asymptomatic cases. That was not a primary endpoint studied. Now, when you look at the other vaccines out there in the world, generally infection is entirely prevented, but in some cases, it just becomes asymptomatic. In some cases, it's even possible to spread. But there is some unpublished data from the Moderna study that they went back and like were doing more testing. They actually found that there's still an effectiveness and reduction of asymptomatic cases of roughly 2/3, which is super duper encouraging. Safety data, almost the entirety of reactions from these vaccines were mild to moderate. Severe reactions were incredibly rare, like significantly less than 1 in 1,000. And no deaths that were attributed to the vaccine. So if you look at the Pfizer study, 4 people died from the placebo group and 2 people died in the vaccine group. And you certainly expect, if you watch a very large group of people, tens of thousands of people, for long enough that some of them naturally die, whether it's a car accident or whatever, but nothing that was associated with the vaccine in the vaccine arm. In the Moderna group, there were no vaccine deaths, and there was 1 placebo death, and that death was actually due to severe COVID-19 infection. So yeah, one placebo death due to COVID-19. That person did not have the actual vaccine. Also, you'll note I mentioned there were 2 doses. They actually did single dose trials in a small group and found that was not nearly as effective as having that booster dose. That's not unlike many of the other vaccines that we have in our lives. Some vaccines need to be boosted every couple of years. Think back to the Hep B vaccine that you all took to be healthcare providers. That was multi-dose as well. But what floors me here is just how effective this vaccine was. And it was effective even in older folks too, who typically have less robust response to vaccine. FDA was willing to accept 50% vaccine effectiveness. We have 95%. That's remarkable. Like most vaccines are not that effective, like very, very few. I mean, we're really lucky that, say, the measles vaccine is 97 to 99% effective with 2 doses. And that's one of the most effective vaccines known to mankind, which is good because measles is the most contagious disease known to mankind. I digress. Talking about serious adverse effects, if you look at, like, say, Moderna, out of about 15,000 vaccine recipients, there were 5 serious adverse events. And in the placebo group, there were 4 in 15,000. So very little difference. And I think it's worth noting, like, what's the most common adverse event? When you look at it, it's like site reactions, swelling, redness, and pain at the spot where they stick you with a needle and inject you with something. Well, shocking. Right? That's the same as any other vaccine that we would get. And then you get other things like maybe some fatigue, headache, and fever. But actually, those are good things. And why is that? It's because we're training the immune system to react, and we're giving it this antigen. We expect it to react. And part of the body's natural systemic reaction are things like fever and things that go along with that, some malaise, some muscle aches. That's the immune system working and training without suffering the infection. But when you look at the severity of these reactions, Most of them are mild to moderate. And what do I mean by that? Like mild is you're aware of it. Moderate is, say, if I have a moderate injection site reaction, my arm hurts. Maybe I don't want to do push-ups levels of hurt, but it doesn't really affect my day. So that's what we mean when we say mild to moderate. It is worth noting that the reactions were typically more significant after the second dose, which we would expect because the immune system is now more trained to react. And most people should expect to have those site reactions. You know, probably like 80, 90% of people are going to have a sore arm. But how many people are going to get fever? Well, now you're talking like 1 or 2 in 10 may develop the fever, but most of it's mild and not even requiring Tylenol. You know, maybe 1 in 4 might get some chills, some muscle pain, or a headache. This shouldn't be shocking to us, or it shouldn't dissuade us from it. Again, that's the immune system working, because what we should think about in terms of this vaccine is like this is amazing that we have this. This is the first step in turning the tide and ending this pandemic. We've had surges in cases, we've had ebbs. This can be the beginning of a permanent ebb. It can be the ending of the restrictions and the mitigations that have been like so painful for us all. Yes, they have benefits, but we can't deny their effects. We want that to end. We want to not have to sacrifice and suffer people we know being sick, people we care about and love being sick. Like most of us probably know someone who either was sick or someone whose family member was seriously ill or passed away. And those of us who are working in healthcare are well aware of the blood, sweat, and tears and long hours that have gone into caring for these patients. The vaccine is the only way to end this, the only way to herd immunity or community immunity. And this is the light at the end of our tunnel. It's not a train, I promise. So that kind of brings us to the end of the presentation. I'll go through a couple of common questions, and then we can jump into audience questions. So again, the vast majority of side effects were mild to moderate. I think you've probably heard in the news that there have been some cases of severe immune reaction. So I think it's worth noting that when they do these studies of like tens of thousands of people, what you don't necessarily capture are effects that are seen in the 1 to 100,000 or the 1 in a million range. Not that those effects aren't felt very strongly by those 1 in 100,000, 1 in a million folks. That's not good for them. But I think it's worth noting that in the case of a pandemic, it's all about risk versus benefit. And if you think about the fact that infection rates are so high that those who don't get vaccinated, if we don't get herd immunity, you're likely at some point to get COVID-19. Maybe it's not this month, maybe it's next year. But if you do, then you're subject to the effects of that, which are not just life or death, it's everything in between. We know that even in low risk groups, there's significant long-term effects, and there's a significant chance of being severely ill, or at least mild or moderately ill, which is incredibly unpleasant. Perhaps vaccination and the costs associated with all of that, those are bad things. So when you think about the fact that we've vaccinated maybe a few million folks, and there's maybe a few dozen bad allergic reactions, that's concerning for those people. But if you infect a few million people with COVID-19, well, even if we said that they were all low risk, well, now you're dealing with hundreds to thousands of deaths and thousands to tens of thousands of hospitalizations. That becomes a relatively easy risk-benefit balance to look at, like, well, is the vaccine worth it or not? Clearly, the fact that you can give millions of doses of it and not have anyone die, that's a lot better than having the disease run rampant. Which brings up the obvious question of like, well, okay, well, that's what effects are going on right now. What about long-term effects? What about long-term immunity? Like, is this thing even worth it for the long term? Well, the answer to long-term effects is that those, again, are incredibly rare with vaccines, unless they're associated with severe reactions that you see either immediately or in the short term, which is why the FDA refused to move on the EUA until they had at least a median of 60 days out. And some of the data is like 9 months out from vaccination, but at minimum 60 days out from second dose. If you're not seeing a strong signal of these severe effects that are associated with long-term effects, then historically we haven't seen those long-term effects except in great rarity. And again, it's not that those don't matter, it's that this is all risk benefit, and the risk vastly outweighs this uncertainty that we can constrain to a rare, if it exists at all, risk of long-term effects. But what about long-term benefit? Well, you may hear people saying, well, it gives you 3 months. Well, they say that because that's all that we're certain about, because that's all that we have data about from the vaccine. But we certainly expect it to be much longer. And why do we expect that? We actually have good data on COVID infections. Remember, we talked about like 3 compartments of immunity, your T cells, B cells, and antibodies. 3-compartment immunity was fairly well demonstrated, like 6 to 9 months out from infection in a recent study. So we also know that these vaccines are actually better at generating immunity than natural infection. And for some people, much, much, much better. And the reason is some of the effects of a COVID-19 infection are basically suppressing your immune system or making it malfunction or making it attack your own body instead of the virus. Those things are not generally happening with the vaccination, and they've actually managed the spike protein that's created from the vaccine to make it more immunogenic, which is good for this long-term immunity. So we think it will be a long-term immunity. And some might ask, well, what about flu? We get flu vaccines every season. Yes, but you don't get measles vaccines every season. Measles is an RNA virus. We're still using the same vaccine that was developed in the 50s. Flu is not a monolithic infection. So it's actually this swarm of horribly mutating viruses out there that are in these immunologically distinct strains. And by that, I mean, like, if you get infected with flu strain A, you can then later get infected by flu strain B because they're so different in the eyes of your immune system that immunity to one, that immunity doesn't necessarily cross over. SARS-CoV-2 does not mutate at the rate of flu. That's a good thing. Does it mutate some? You've probably heard it in the news. Yes, it does, but we don't think that it's generated this vaccine escape problem. In fact, the experts think that the vaccines will continue to be effective against these minor mutations that we've seen, and that's good. Will you test positive for COVID if you get this? No. PCRs, the gold standard test, or an antigen test, you won't test positive. The only way you could test positive is to an antibody test for COVID. Can you get COVID from the vaccine? You cannot. That's impossible. Why? Because the vaccine does not contain COVID, doesn't contain the SARS-CoV-2 virus, just the instruction to make a little surface protein that your body recognizes and can attack on the virus. In the mRNA vaccines, there's no controversial ingredients, as you might have heard in cell line production and some of the others under development. That's not in the Pfizer or the Moderna virus, although I heard the Pope gave his go-ahead for those who were concerned about those other vaccines. What if you've had COVID already, should you get the vaccine? So there's limited data on this because that was actually some of the exclusion criteria for these trials. We do know that in rare cases, you can get COVID twice, but most of the time not. We think that probably in the cases where it is so, it's probably something similar to those who don't react so well to creating immunity to the vaccine in the first place. Those are probably the folks who get COVID once and then get it again. But if you've had it, we assume that you're immune for probably about 3 months. So there's not necessarily a rush for you to go out and get the vaccine, but you certainly can. It's not contraindicated. There was a suggestion by CDC Ethics Committee that that might be a good thing to wait on just while it's super limited. But you certainly can get the vaccine. Let's see, what if you are pregnant or lactating? So there's no real safety data on this. There's probably about 30-ish folks who ended up in these studies who were pregnant, despite the attempt to exclude them. There were no vaccine arm pregnancies that had any pregnancy-associated side effects. But again, the data is super limited. What we do know is that, again, this is not a live vaccine. It doesn't affect human DNA at all. mRNA degrades super quickly. And all these are suggestive of safety, but not proof. However, looking at the risk of COVID, we know that COVID-19 in pregnancy has increased risk of severe illness, ICU admission, mechanical ventilation, or pregnancy-related complications like the need for a crash C-section, preterm birth, placenta abruptia, or stillbirths. So because of the known risks, the recommendation is that pregnant women who would otherwise be eligible for the vaccine can certainly get it. It's recommended they have discussions with their healthcare providers. An ACOG, or the American College of Gynecologists, has recommended that conversation and generally recommended the vaccine. Here's the big question I get at the hospital. Do I still have to wear PPE? Well, unfortunately, at least for now, the answer is yes, because as you've seen, for some people, even though it's a small percentage, the vaccine won't work. So out of an abundance of caution, we still have people wear appropriate PPE, just like they would for someone who had chicken pox or measles or any other infectious vaccine preventable disease despite vaccination. And will you turn into a zombie? I don't know. It's 2020, man. I got my vaccine a week ago. I had a sore arm for 36 hours, and I've had no more inclination to eat people's brains than usual, which is, just a little bit. But if that happens, like it's 2020, I'll embrace the new. I'll just roll with it, right? But yeah, probably not I Am Legend. Okay. Those are the slides I have for you. I hope this was useful. I went on a little longer than I'd meant to. Do people have questions? I can try and answer them.
Aaron, this is Alex. Is that slide or the recording that you're doing something you could share with us for us to reshare with our spouses or something like that, if they're interested?
Yeah, sure.
Cool.
Question in the chat is, if I get vaccinated, can I still be a carrier and transmit COVID-19 to someone who has not been vaccinated? And the answer is, we don't. The data says we don't know. The suggested data from Moderna says the chances are greatly reduced. And our knowledge from other vaccine preventable illnesses is probably you cannot, but possibly you can. So that's why you're seeing these recommendations out there from public health authorities saying like, well, yeah, no one's a real fan of wearing a mask around all the time. I'm certainly not. But even though you're vaccinated, you should still follow all of these public health precautions. And the answer is probably going to change as we get more data. And I'm certainly hopeful that the answer is going to be okay, yes, if you're immune, if we can get an antibody titer off you, you can't get it anymore and you can't pass it on and you can't get these asymptomatic transmissions. And hey, maybe we can even stop wearing masks. And certainly if we reach herd immunity, we'll be able to stop with that and return back to the normal that we all crave. So yeah, there's my non-answer for you. Other questions? Were all cancer patients excluded from the trials? No, not all of them were. There were some people who were profoundly immunosuppressed were, but not all cancer patients. And there may actually be a recommendation for those on certain types of chemotherapy to be moved up the priority tiers on receiving vaccination, because we certainly know that they're at greater risk if they do get infected. Can you talk about allergic reactions if we have allergies? So that's a really good question. I think a lot of people are wondering about this because lots of people have allergies ranging from like hay fever to I carry an EpiPen, so someone's chucking a peanut at me doesn't cause me to die. So kind of the way that gets stratified out is the best guidance we have, and again, these allergic reactions are super rare and they weren't really seen in the safety trials. But if you have a history of serious allergic reactions that are not related to vaccines or a specific ingredient in these vaccines, the recommendation is going to be to hang out for 30 minutes after you get your shot to make sure that you don't have a severe reaction out of an abundance of caution. The only people who are contraindicated are those with a history of severe allergic reaction, like anaphylaxis to a component of these vaccines. And if you're like, well, what's in them? Like I said, not a whole lot. You can look at the specific ingredients on the EUA fact sheets. If you just, I could have probably provided links to that. Sorry, I didn't, but you can Google like Moderna EUA fact sheet if you're up for the Moderna vaccine. And they do have ingredients. So like things that aren't in there, eggs that are used in the creation of like the flu vaccine, that's not a contraindication to getting the COVID vaccine. If we can't get the vaccine scheduled as it becomes available now, when will we get scheduled? Or when will we get another chance? So I can really only speak to my knowledge of the Summit County process. And that is like we got 900 Moderna doses delivered yesterday for the county. And that's what's currently up for scheduling. We're getting, and the good news is we actually found out that there were 10% more doses. The vials had more vaccine in them than was thought. So we actually ended up with like 990 doses. That's good. We're getting 100 doses of Pfizer next week, which those are also overpack vials. So we'll get 120, and you'll get a chance. You'll get a link to be able to sign up for some vaccine clinics next week, but the appointments will be more limited. But because we're all privileged as first responders and healthcare providers to be able to sign up now, you don't lose all opportunity just because you couldn't make it now. That will continue to be available to you ongoing as vaccine stocks continue to come in. The focus is going to move beyond the first responders to include other essential workers in the community, those at the highest risk, such as over age 75, and those with certain health conditions. And then eventually in the later spring, moving on to the general public. But you'll continue to have opportunities, hopefully on a weekly basis as these vaccine deliveries come. And that's important too, because even if you might be able to swing your appointment now and you're like, well, I absolutely can't make the follow-up appointment, then it may be best to defer a week until you can make both your initial and your follow-up appointment, because the recommendation is they want you to get it exactly 21 or 28 days, Pfizer or Moderna, after. But there is a window of about plus or minus 4 days. And if you miss that, it's still okay. It's not like they're saying that they don't think it's effective at all. Just the studies are based on these fixed timeframes, and so that's what they're trying to stick closest to, because the efficacy data was generated on those strict timeframes. If you look at other vaccines that were given, then we know that timeframes aren't quite as strict, and vaccines are still effective with these booster doses. We hope that's the case here, but the recommendations are strict right now because we don't have the data to say otherwise. Any info regarding kids? So the Moderna study was age 18 and up. The Pfizer study was age 16 and up. There wasn't as wide of inclusion in that 16, 17-year-old range, but they've expanded the phase 3 trials, and this is very, very normal when you're doing vaccine or drug development, as you start out in these less ethically complex and better understood populations, like say 18 to 65. You start out there, and when you get really good safety signal and really good efficacy, then you start stepping down, and what I expect to see is they'll start stepping it down and including down to, I don't know, 14, then 12. And as those generate good safety and efficacy signals, they can continue to go down. I think another reason they didn't jump on the kids early on wasn't just, it was a different factor of ethics. We know that that's the lowest risk for morbidity and mortality. Kids age 1 to 17 are the least likely to have severe courses of disease. Other questions? Did the study give any data regarding impact to fertility? There's no data on that one way or the other. What we do know is I'm not aware of any vaccine that has had fertility effects. And the thing about mRNA vaccines is this. Again, in your cell, the way that your cell creates a protein is within the nuclear envelope lives your DNA, the code for all of our life. Very structurally different than RNA. And in there, it can kind of unzip itself and make a copy that gets imprinted and created as messenger RNA, which then gets let out of that nuclear envelope into the cytoplasm of your cell. And so then in the endoplasmic reticulum, you've got these ribosomes and it creates proteins. That is a one-way process. It does not go backwards. The mRNA does not go back into the nucleus and cannot, because of the chemical structure of the molecules, cannot affect the DNA. And that means that the mRNA vaccine is also bound by that. All of its activity is within the cytoplasm of the cell, and it cannot enter the nucleus, and it cannot affect DNA. So there should be no effect in those terms on our DNA, which I think would suggest good reproductive safety. And that's the best answer I can give you. I would be beyond shocked if we found anything relating to fertility. However, what we do have evidence of is that there are effects on fertility from COVID infection. Unfortunately, we know that it does enter the testes in males, and it may have some effects on male reproduction. And again, that was for COVID-19 infection. Good question. Other questions? I've heard different things about how long we need to wait between flu and COVID vaccines. How long do we need to wait? Excellent question. So the guidance right now is a 14-day spacing between COVID-19 vaccine and other vaccines. Other questions? What about the Will Smith photo? That's from the movie I Am Legend. Definitely a worthy watch. What about you two jokes? Yes, I also heard that that the U2 album will be included in the vaccine. Luckily for me, that's not true. Well, maybe luckily, maybe not. It depends what you think of U2. And then what about tracking for Bill Gates and 5G? I can tell you my reception has been really bad and my Wi-Fi speeds have been really, really slow. So don't expect any benefits there. I don't know about Bill Gates tracking me, but that would be good because he's rich. And if he can find me, I can find him, and I have plans. Other questions? All right. Well, I think we're right on the hour. I will share this recording when I figure out a good way to do that. Yes, I could repeat a Q&A session, but not. Let's do that next week. I think we all want to enjoy Christmas. Yeah, glad you all enjoyed it. Hopefully this was useful. You may have heard vaccines save lives, but the truth is vaccination saves lives. And all of you are respected members of your community as first responders and as healthcare providers. And we have the opportunity to do something that doesn't just protect us, it protects others, it protects our community. And the thing about vaccine is it's not just about our individual benefit. The aggregate of all the individual risk reductions, what that adds up to is less than the total benefit of this vaccine if we can get to herd immunity. Okay. Have a great night, everyone. If you think of more questions, feel free to shoot me an email.